What happens when a member of royalty walks onto a late-night set, thinking the world owes them an explanation, only to discover that one host refuses to play along? In just 36 seconds of unfiltered confrontation, a prince's composure would shatter on live television, exposing an ego that couldn't handle being questioned. This is the story of how Greg Gutfeld's show became the stage for one of the most shocking meltdowns in talk show history. The studio lights were hot that evening, the audience packed in tight, expecting the usual back-and-forth banter that made the show famous. Greg sat at his desk, relaxed, confident, ready to do what he does best: entertain and challenge his guests in equal measure. Then Prince Harry walked out. The applause was polite, but cautious. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a typical interview. Harry had been making headlines for months, and not the good kind. Every interview seemed to bring more complaints, more grievances, more scores to settle. But Greg wasn't the type to softball anyone, royal or not. "Welcome to the show," Greg said, gesturing to the chair beside his desk. "Thanks for coming on. I know you've got a lot to say these days." Harry settled into the chair with an air of someone who expected deference. "Thanks for having me, though I have to say, I wasn't sure what to expect from a show like this." "A show like this?" Greg's eyebrow raised slightly. "What does that mean?" "Well, you know," Harry said, waving a hand dismissively. "American cable news. It's all a bit loud, isn't it? Not exactly the thoughtful discourse we're used to." The audience went quiet. You could feel the tension starting to build. Greg smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who just saw the guest make their first mistake. "Thoughtful discourse," Greg repeated slowly. "That's interesting coming from someone who spent the last year doing tell-all interviews on every platform that'll have you. But sure, we're the loud ones." Harry's expression tightened. "I've been sharing my truth. That's not the same thing." "Your truth," Greg said, leaning back in his chair. "See, that's a phrase I've never quite understood. There's the truth, and then there's what you want people to believe. Which one are we getting tonight?" "Are you calling me a liar?" Harry's voice rose just enough for everyone to notice. "I'm asking you a question," Greg replied calmly. "That's what interviewers do. Or did you think this was going to be another one of those sit-downs where someone nods along while you talk about how hard your life has been?" The audience stirred. Some nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. This was escalating faster than anyone anticipated. Harry sat forward, his face flushing. "You don't know anything about my life. You sit here in your comfortable studio, making jokes about people you've never met, judging situations you couldn't possibly understand." "You're right," Greg Dapper said, not backing down an inch. "I don't know what it's like to grow up in a palace. I don't know what it's like to have every need catered to since birth. I don't know what it's like to inherit wealth and position I never earned. Must be tough." "That's exactly the problem," Harry shot back. "People like you reduce everything to these cheap talking points. You have no idea what it's like to have your privacy invaded, your family torn apart by the media, to lose your mother because of photographers chasing her car." The mood in the studio shifted. Greg's expression softened for just a moment. "That was a tragedy. Nobody's disputing that. But you've been trading on that tragedy for years now. At what point does it become less about honoring her memory and more about justifying every choice you make?" Harry stood up, not quickly, but deliberately. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this." "Actually, you do," Greg said, still seated, still calm. "You agreed to come on this show. You knew what kind of show this is. You don't get to walk into someone's house and then complain about the furniture. This is exactly the kind of disrespect I've been talking about," Harry said, his voice getting louder. "I came here to have a conversation, not to be attacked by some commentator who thinks he's clever." Greg stood up now too, matching Harry's energy, but keeping his tone measured. "You came here because your approval ratings are tanking, And you thought you could win over an American audience by playing the victim one more time. But here's the thing. Americans don't have much patience for people who complain about their privilege while living in a mansion. The audience was completely silent now. Every eye in the room locked on the two men facing each other. I've done more for charity, for veterans, for mental health awareness than you could ever dream of, Harry said, pointing at Greg. What have you done except sit behind a desk and mock people? I'm not the one being interviewed here, Greg replied. But since you asked, I've never pretended to be something I'm not. I've never claimed to want privacy while selling my story to the highest bidder. I've never talked about family loyalty while trashing my own family on international television. You have no right to talk about my family. Harry's voice cracked slightly. You don't know what they did to me. You don't know what I've been through. Then tell us, Greg said, spreading his arms wide. That's why you're here, isn't it? To tell us all how wronged you've been. Go ahead. The floor is yours. Harry's jaw clenched. I don't need to justify myself to you. But you do need to justify yourself to someone, don't you? Greg pressed. That's what all of this is about. You made choices. You walked away from your duties. You moved to another country. You signed deals worth millions to talk about how oppressed you were. And now, you're angry that not everyone's buying it. I walked away. To protect my family, Harry said, his voice shaking now. I walked away because I refused to let history repeat itself. My mother was destroyed by the institution, and I wasn't going to let the same thing happen to my wife. That's a nice narrative, Greg said. Very compelling. There's just one problem. Your mother never cashed in on her pain. She never did paid interviews about how terrible the royal family was. She maintained her dignity even when things were falling apart. Can you say the same? That was the breaking point. Harry's face went red. How dare you compare me to my mother? You didn't know her. You have no right to use her to make your pathetic points. I'm not using her, Greg said firmly. You are. Every time you invoke her memory to justify why you're selling out your family, you're using her. Every time you act like you're honoring her by doing the exact opposite of what she would have done, you're using her. That's it, Harry said, ripping off his microphone. I'm done with this. I'm done with you. This whole thing is a joke. The only joke here, Greg said, as Harry started to walk off the set, is that you thought you could come on this show and not get asked real questions. This isn't a therapy session. This is television. If you can't handle pushback, maybe you should stick to podcasts where they let you ramble without interruption. Harry spun around, pointing his finger at Greg from across the set. You're a small, bitter man who makes a living tearing down people better than you. That's all you are. That's all you'll ever be. And you're a prince who gave up his crown so he could complain about having to wear it, Greg fired back. At least I'm honest about what I do. You want honesty? Harry's voice echoed through the studio. Here's some honesty. This show is garbage. You're garbage. This whole network is garbage. The only reason anyone watches is because they're too lazy to change the channel. The audience gasped. Greg just smiled. There it is, Greg said quietly. The real you. Not the polished, media-trained prince. Not the humanitarian who cares so much about mental health. Just an entitled brat who can't handle being questioned. I don't have to take this, Harry said, already backing toward the exit. I don't have to stand here and be insulted by someone like you. Someone like me, Greg repeated. You mean someone who worked their way up? Someone who didn't inherit their platform? Someone who actually earned their position instead of being born into it? Harry didn't respond. He just turned and walked off the set, leaving his microphone on the floor where he'd thrown it. Greg turned back to the camera, composed as ever. Well, that went well. The audience erupted in a mix of applause, nervous laughter, and stunned murmurs. Nobody had expected it to go that far. Nobody had expected a member of the royal family to completely lose their composure on live television. But Greg had seen it coming. From the moment Harry walked out with that superior attitude, with that expectation that he'd be treated with kid gloves. Greg knew exactly how it would end. Because that's the thing about people who think they're above criticism. They can't handle it when someone refuses to bow down. The show cut to commercial break. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled to figure out what to do next. Harry was already out of the building, reportedly furious, demanding that the segment never air. But this was live television. It had already aired. Millions of people had just watched a prince throw a tantrum because a talk show host refused to treat him like royalty. When the show came back from break, Greg addressed what had just happened. For those of you just joining us, Prince Harry was our guest tonight. I say was because he decided to leave. Apparently, asking follow-up questions is considered disrespectful when you're used to everyone agreeing with everything you say. Who knew? He shuffled some papers on his desk, playing it casual. Look, I get it. Change is hard. Going from a life where everyone calls you Your Royal Highness to a life where you're just another celebrity trying to stay relevant, that's an adjustment. But here's the thing. If you're going to put yourself out there, if you're going to do interviews and write books and sign streaming deals, you don't get to pick and choose which questions you answer. That's not how this works. The audience applauded again, louder this time. I have nothing against the guy personally, Greg continued. I really don't. I'm sure he's been through things that are difficult. I'm sure there's pain there. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, am I healing or am I performing? Am I working through my issues or am I monetizing them? And I think tonight we got our answer. He leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera. You can't spend years talking about how much you value privacy, and then get upset when people point out that you've done the opposite. You can't talk about wanting to live a normal life while living in a mansion and doing deals with streaming services. You can't criticize the media and then use that same media to tell your side of the story. At some point, the contradiction becomes too obvious to ignore. More applause. The audience was firmly on Greg's side now. And you definitely can't come on a show like this and expect softball questions. That's not what we do here. We push back. We challenge. We ask the questions other people are afraid to ask. If you don't like that, don't come on the show. It's pretty simple. Someone in the audience shouted their agreement. Greg smiled. But if you do come on and you agree to sit down for an interview, then have the decency to actually engage. Don't storm off like a child when someone disagrees with you. Don't throw your microphone and insult everyone in the building because you didn't get the fawning treatment you expected. That's not how adults behave. That's how toddlers behave. He paused, letting that sink in. The irony, of course, is that Harry's whole brand is built on being authentic, being real, speaking his truth. But the moment someone challenges that truth, the moment someone asks him to defend his choices, he falls apart. That tells you everything you need to know. Real strength doesn't require everyone to agree with you. Real confidence can withstand criticism. Real authenticity means being honest, even when it's uncomfortable. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Greg waved them down, staying humble. Anyway, that's enough about that. We've got more show to do. Let's bring out our next guest, someone who actually knows how to handle a conversation. And just like that, it was over. The segment that would be replayed millions of times online. The moment that would define how people saw both men. Greg Gutfeld, the host who refused to bend. Prince Harry, the guest who couldn't handle the heat. In the aftermath, the clips spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with reactions. Some people defended Harry, saying Greg had been too harsh, too disrespectful. But the majority saw it differently. They saw a man who talks constantly about accountability, failing to hold himself accountable. They saw someone who preaches about mental health having a very public breakdown. They saw the mask slip. And Greg just kept doing his show. Because that's what professionals do. They don't storm off when things get uncomfortable. They don't throw tantrums when someone disagrees with them. They do their job. The lesson was clear. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. If you put yourself in the public eye, you're going to face criticism. You're going to be challenged. You're going to encounter people who don't worship the ground you walk on. And how you handle that says everything about your character. Harry failed that test. Spectacularly. In front of millions of viewers, he showed that underneath all the talk about growth and healing and moving forward, there was still an entitled prince who expected the world to cater to him. Greg, meanwhile, proved exactly why his show works. He treats everyone the same. He doesn't care about titles or status or fame. He cares about honesty. And sometimes honesty is uncomfortable. Sometimes it means asking the questions nobody else will ask. Sometimes it means calling out hypocrisy, even when it's coming from someone powerful. That's what made this moment so compelling. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It was two people with completely different worldviews colliding in real time. One man who believed his title and his trauma gave him immunity from criticism. Another man who believed nobody is above being questioned. Only one of them was still sitting at the desk when the segment ended. The exchange became a case study in how not to handle an interview. Communication experts analyzed every moment, pointing out where Harry went wrong. Media trainers used it as an example of what happens when you let your emotions override your preparation. Public relations professionals winced at the damage control nightmare it created. But for Greg's audience, it was something else entirely. It was validation. Validation that their instincts about Harry were correct. Validation that the polished image he'd been selling didn't match the reality. Validation that you can't buy credibility with streaming deals and best-selling books. The entire confrontation lasted less than 15 minutes from start to finish. 15 minutes that changed how millions of people viewed both men. 15 minutes that proved live television can still create genuine, unscripted moments of drama. Greg never apologized. He never backed down. When asked about the incident later, he simply said, "I asked fair questions. If he couldn't handle that, that's on him, not on me." Harry, for his part, reportedly tried to have the footage pulled, tried to claim he'd been ambushed, tried to spin it as another example of the media mistreating him. But the footage spoke for itself. Anyone watching could see that Greg had been tough, but fair. Could see that Harry had arrived with an attitude and left with his reputation in tatters. The microphone Harry threw on his way out became a symbol of privilege meeting reality. A symbol of what happens when someone who's used to being coddled finally encounters genuine pushback. A symbol of the gap between who Harry claimed to be and who he actually was when the pressure was on. For Greg's show, it was a defining moment. The night they proved they wouldn't bow to anyone, no matter how famous, no matter how connected, no matter how much they complained about being a victim. The night they showed that their commitment to honest conversation wasn't just marketing, it was real. And for Harry, it was a moment he'd probably rather forget. But the internet never forgets. The clips would live forever. The memes would never stop. The questions about his temperament and his authenticity would follow him for years. All because he couldn't handle 36 seconds of real questioning. All because he walked into a studio expecting worship and found a host who refused to play along. All because he forgot the most important rule of live television. Once you sit down in that chair, you're not royalty anymore. You're just another guest. And if you can't handle that, you shouldn't be there at all.